Chapter 6 of the book of Daniel comprises one of the most well-known stories in the Hebrew scriptures, what we know as the Old Testament. It's a story that I guess most, maybe all of us, were read in Sunday school, and we were taught its message that God looks after his own. It's the story of an amazing rescue, or amazing protection, if you like. Daniel gets thrown to the lions, but emerges the following day unharmed. So let's look at this story and see what we can learn from it, apart from the obvious. But let's begin by reminding ourselves of the purpose of the book of Daniel. Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, were Israelites in exile in Babylon. They were taken along with tens of thousands of their fellow Israelites from Jerusalem and Judea when the Babylonians captured Jerusalem. They were to spend 70 years in exile. They were strangers in a strange land. They were far from the temple in Jerusalem, which had been the centre of their religious and social life. They were separated from the presence of God, they felt. The presence of God, which was considered to dwell uniquely in the temple in Jerusalem. And they were struggling to work out how they could be faithful to their God Yahweh while in exile. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land, they asked. Daniel and his friends don't compromise, or at least they know where to draw the line and say this far and no further. They are shining examples of faithfulness to their God Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. Faithfulness despite the difficult circumstances they found themselves in. The stories in the book of Daniel were told and later written down to encourage the exiles, probably while they were still in captivity in Babylon, and later when they were struggling to rebuild the city walls and temple in Jerusalem after they were allowed to return from exile. To encourage them to persevere, to remain faithful, to remind them that while kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall, God goes on and on and on. As we've said before, the stories of Daniel and indeed the whole book were amongst the most discussed, debated and pored over of all Hebrew scriptures in the period that became known as the Second Temple period, from the rebuilding of the temple after the return from exile through to its final destruction by the Romans in 70 AD. A period of more than 500 years, including the time of Jesus' earthly ministry. Jesus himself used the book of Daniel, as we will see next time. The book of Daniel not only provides encouragement, it can do the same for us today when we're faced with difficult times and times when God seems to be getting pushed out of the picture. It shows how God uses not only his people, the Israelites, to fulfill his purposes, but also how God uses pagan rulers. God is the God of all. We're all his people. We're all made in the image of God, as the writer of Genesis reminds us. And as such, we are all loved by God and may be used by God to fulfill his purposes. Anyway, let's look at the story of Daniel and the fasting lions. If we read the book of Daniel chronologically, this story won't come as a surprise. We've had a very similar story back in Daniel chapter 3, the story of the fiery furnace. Another deliverance, another dramatic rescue. But on that occasion, it was Daniel's three friends, not Daniel, who were in trouble. And it was a different ruler. Back then it was Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king. Here it's Darius, the Persian king. What do we learn about Darius, or what can we surmise from what the writer of this account tells us? And we do have to do a bit of summarising because the story is not told in great detail. There's a real economy of language used to tell this vital story. And I'm not going to spend too much time retelling the story today. Most of you will be very familiar with it. And if not, hopefully you've had a look at it before listening to this message. If not, well, you might like to pause and do that before continuing listening. So what about Darius? Darius, the king, clearly likes Daniel. He's promoted him to be one of 3 vice regents, in effect deputy king almost, or prime minister, a very senior and privileged position. And we're told that Daniel was so good in the role that the king decided to put him in charge of the whole kingdom, his second in command. Darius takes Daniel's God seriously, although it's not clear whether he only took him seriously after this event. However, Darius believes Daniel's God not only can but will save Daniel. Although some translations soften verse 16, the better translations have Darius say to Daniel, "Your God will save you." Or, as the Message version of the Bible puts it, "Your God, to whom you are so loyal, is going to get you out of this." So why did Daniel agree to this new law? The law or decree that required that for 30 days no one was to pray to any other god or person except Darius. Well, Darius was the new king. Perhaps he saw it as a way of cementing his power, ensuring he had no opposition or rivals. And if he did have rivals, this decree might smoke them out and enable him to get rid of them. It provided the promise of more power, the promise of absolute power. Those who proposed the law, the other 2 vice regents and the governors, flattered the king. They flattered the king by using the greeting, "Live forever, may you live forever," although that may have been the usual term of greeting for a king at that time. Daniel himself uses it later in the account. But by proposing this law or decree, they are pandering to the king's ego and thereby flattering the king. Was Darius aware of Daniel's God before this, I wonder? It seems likely, as Daniel clearly wasn't someone who kept his faith hidden. And Darius's comments on Daniel's loyalty to his God, although this may simply be because he's just learned Daniel was continuing prayer, but he either didn't think this one through, or he thought Daniel would simply keep his head down when this new proclamation, this new law was made. Because Darius tried to get Daniel off. When he was told about Daniel ignoring the new decree, "Daniel, one of your Jewish exiles, ignores your king. 3 times a day he prays," his advisors tell him. Notice how his accusers use such a dismissive term, "one of the Jewish exiles," to describe one of the king's vice regents, the second in command in the empire. When he's informed of Daniel's continued praying, we're told he's very upset and he tries his best to get Daniel out of the fix he'd put him in. In fact, we're told he worked all day to try to get Daniel off, to try and find a loophole, a way around this. Not something you'd expect a king to do, but a measure of how much he respected and valued Daniel. When he wasn't successful and Daniel is thrown to the lions, we're told that Daniel fasted all night and was unable to sleep. This is a pagan king doing all he can to protect one of his leaders, but a foreigner. This is a pagan king resorting to fasting. And we might ask, was it Daniel's faithfulness that kept him safe, or was it Darius's intervention, Darius's fasting? Now, I guess the obvious answer is it was Daniel's faithfulness. Daniel's righteousness. But what if? Was it Daniel's faith in his God, or was it Darius's faith in Daniel's God that saved Daniel? Darius believed Yahweh not only could but would rescue Daniel. Your God is going to get you out of this. In other words, I can't get you out of it, but your God can. And that's some faith. He must have been quite confident, otherwise he wouldn't have been down at the lion's den at daybreak. Yes, we're told as he approached the lion's den, he called anxiously to Daniel, but unless he was pretty confident Daniel had been kept safe by his God, he wouldn't have risked looking rather silly calling out to someone who'd spent the night with a pride of hungry lions. And they are hungry because we're told they made short work of finishing off the governors and the vice regents. It wasn't only Darius who fasted that night, the lions did too. But what about Daniel? Daniel was, shock horror, an honest politician. Perhaps the biggest shock of all in this story, a real turn up for the books. The other vice regents and governors are jealous of Daniel. Were they jealous because he was successful? We're told he outclassed the other leaders. Were they jealous because he was an outsider? Were they jealous because he was honest? We don't know. Possibly all of those things caused their jealousy. The other vice regents and governors tried to dig some dirt on Daniel, but they're unable to dig anything up. They tried to find some old scandal or skeleton in Daniel's life, the message says, but they couldn't dig up anything. Daniel was squeaky clean. So they resort to Darius Appreciation Month and their cleverly thought out decree. Daniel wasn't only honest and God-fearing though, Daniel was a man of prayer. We're told that it was Daniel's practice, his custom to pray 3 times a day. And Daniel did this in the upstairs room of his house with the windows wide open. His prayers were public as well as regular. Now, Daniel could have easily avoided this tricky situation. Daniel could have kept his head down. It was only a month. Surely Daniel could have kept his windows closed for that month. He could have prayed in secret. Or he could have gone on holiday for a month. Given his position as vice regent, I'm sure that would have been an option for him. Daniel could have gone into lockdown. But no, Daniel refused to compromise. And once he'd safely negotiated the fasting lines, once God had rescued him, we're told when he was hauled out of the lion's den, there wasn't a scratch on him because he had trusted God. Daniel doesn't say much, but he does say that he'd been found innocent before God and the king, interestingly enough. And it's left to Darius, the pagan king, to really praise God. And Darius issues another decree or proclamation. A proclamation praising Yahweh. Extraordinary words for a pagan king. But I wonder, who do you think wrote those words? Was it Darius, the pagan king? How often do leaders and politicians write their own speeches though? They usually have others do that for them, write them for them to read out, and then they simply put their name to them or read them out. Maybe Darius did write these words, but isn't it possible, perhaps even likely, that Darius had Daniel himself write that proclamation? He was, after all, second in command. When people of faith, through honesty and integrity, find themselves in positions of trust, they're often given the opportunity to be a wider influence. Daniel's influence must have continued to grow after these events, and maybe part of that was being asked to promote his God by writing this proclamation? Who knows? But what can we learn from this remarkable account of Daniel's rescue? Firstly, we can learn that honesty pays, but it can put us in difficult positions. The story ends by saying that Daniel was treated well during the reign of Darius and also in the reign of his successor, Cyrus the Persian. And I think it's likely that although they remained in exile for some years after this, the rest of the exiles were treated reasonably well during their time in and around Babylon. Daniel's honesty got him in trouble with his peers. Daniel's honesty inadvertently got him in trouble with the king. And Daniel's honesty, along with his refusal to compromise when it came to God, resulted in him ending up in a very tight spot, to put it mildly. If we are honest, if we refuse to tell lies, to bear false witness, if we act with integrity as we should as followers of Jesus, God will be pleased with us. But we might end up getting criticised. We might make others suspicious or jealous. We might end up in difficult situations. But we're likely too to end up more valued and trusted by others due to our honesty and integrity. Secondly, we learn from this story of Daniel, God is faithful. Remember, the Old Testament is about God's chosen and called people. The book of Daniel was written to encourage God's chosen and called people. But it's not primarily about individuals. It's not saying that everyone will be physically delivered. It is saying God's people will survive as a people. They won't be crushed as a nation, as a people. The prophet Jeremiah wrote a letter to the exiles in which he reminded them that God had plans for them, that God was going to restore them. I know the plans I have for you. You'll probably know the quote. The you in that plans originally referred to the people. This meant the people, not necessarily individuals. The people who were in a covenant relationship with God. The problem was that throughout the period from the end of the Egyptian exile to the time of Christ, the people had repeatedly failed to keep their side of the bargain, their side of the covenant. They'd gone their own way. They turned to local gods. They'd sinned. Daniel is an example, though, of how God is faithful if the people are faithful. And actually, God doesn't give up on them even if they aren't faithful. Daniel, in some senses, embodies the nation of Israel. Daniel represents Israel. Daniel's faithfulness represents the faithfulness of the whole people of God. In this way, Daniel foreshadows Jesus. What Jesus did, or one of the things Jesus did, perhaps the most significant, was to keep the law without sinning, to keep the whole law of Moses. The people had been unable to do this. Jesus did it on behalf of everyone, the whole people. God is faithful. And then thirdly, God uses others. Here, Darius, rather like King Nebuchadnezzar earlier, ends up praising Daniel's God. Doesn't mean he necessarily became followers of Yahweh, but it does mean they probably treated the exiles better than they would otherwise have done. And then perhaps the last thing that this story can teach us: past success is no guarantee of future success. Chapter 6 of the book of Daniel is a necessary reminder that the life of faith must be lived to the very end, and that early victories and rescues can't be taken as guarantees of future success or the absence of future crises. We may find that in areas such as illness, Coronavirus may strike twice. Unemployment can strike more than once. Lightning can strike twice in that sense. Yesterday's battles may need to be fought again tomorrow. Surviving the fiery furnace didn't guard against being thrown to the lions for the exiles. Surviving battles in the past or battles of today does not mean we'll be exempt from battles in the future. And it doesn't mean we will survive those battles. But God will ultimately rescue us, rescue his people. And that's why we need constant renewing and refreshing in our faith. It's why we need deep roots of faith. And it's why we need to keep close to God in prayer as Daniel did. I hope you'll join me next time when we move on from the stories of Daniel to the prophecies of Daniel and the amazing chapter 7 of the book of Daniel. Until next time, keep well, keep safe, and keep trusting God. Thank you.